Yeah, I was on short notice. I was asked to speak about the Bourne stone. It was something that I'd known a bit about. I hadn't really gone into any study about it or anything like that. And it's one of those sorts of things in New England archaeology you hear about, but as far as I knew, no one had given a lot of serious study really recently. And so I said, sure, I'd love to come down and give a talk about it. I'm never shy about coming out and talking about something, even if I don't know a lot about it. So that's okay. So I came down and I looked at the stone. I looked at all the background research that was down here, the files. There were a couple of big file folders with all the newspaper articles and copies of various letters and books and that sort of thing. They're all in the files here. And I sorted through all that stuff and took a look at the stone myself and came up with some interesting conclusions that I want to share with you tonight. I'm no expert on the stone. I'm no expert on runes. I'm a professional archaeological consultant. I'm an archaeologist who goes out and does archaeological digs all across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I wouldn't even say I'm an expert on that. I've been doing it for 25 years and I'm still learning. So I'm still an archaeological student, I guess, in that sense. But I'll share a bit with you tonight about what I found out about the Bourne stone, a bit you probably already know about, a bit that we've sort of just recently figured out, some interesting things about it, and you can go take a look at the stone yourself and see it yourself. I'm never going to have the answers. You're never going to have the answers. Someone made it a long time ago. And we're never going to know exactly what it means. But all right, the Bourne stone, which is right in the other room there, it's made out of pink Falmouth granite, very hard stone. It's about 4 feet long. It's about 1.5 feet wide. Weighs, I guess, about 300 pounds from what I've read. Some say 200, some say 300. I didn't try to lift it up, so I couldn't tell you exactly what it weighs. But like I said, it's located right out there. It has a number of carvings on it, and mysterious kind of carvings on it there. The history of it, one of the things that I wanted to see when I was looking at the background research was what's the documented history about the Bourne stone? Do we actually know if it came from Indian meeting house, a Christian Indian meeting house at Great Herring Pond, and where did that story come from? As an archaeologist, what I'm always trying to do is I'm always trying to search for the facts about something and trying to take those facts and make it into a plausible story. And that story is what archaeologists call hypotheses, and they're always changing as new facts come in and such. So what I was trying to do with the Bourne stone is just gather as many facts as I could and try to put them into a story that would make the most sense with what we know about the archaeology in the area, what we know about the history of the town, the history of Cape Cod, and the history of the stone. And so to start with, the most common history that we have is that it's reported to be the entry stone to the Christian Indian meeting house at Herring Pond. It was reportedly moved to the Andrew Jackson / Catherine Parker home site, which we didn't really know where it was, but eventually we found out. And it was bought or given around 1930 when the Patuxent Trading Post opened by Percival Hall Lombard to the Bourne Historical Society from a Miss Fisher. That's all we really know about it. Those are the only real facts we had about it. And from the background research I was able to do in the files here at the Historical Society, it looks like this history of it, although it's never documented in any kind of primary documents or anything like that, this history has always been attached to the stone as far back as you can trace the stone's history here at the Historical Society. So it looks like that's a story that was not created, a history was not created in recent times, and that actually ties in with the documents that are here. So it sounds like a really good place to start. It's a stone that was an entry stone at the Christian Indian meeting house, removed to the Andrew Jackson house and bought to the Bourne Historical Society around 1930. The inscription, this is the traditional inscription interpretation. What I've noticed is when I was going through the documentation and when I've looked at things online is that most people who've done work on the Bourne stone have never actually come down and seen it. What they've done is they've used this traditional inscription that was widely available in books and those sorts of things, and have never actually come down, at least the earlier folks, never actually come down and seen the stone and taken a look at it and gotten their own interpretation that way. They've just taken this and say, oh, well, this looks like this and this looks like that, without actually seeing the stone itself. The first interpretation was back in 1935 by an Edmund B. Delabere, professor at Brown University. Said the inscriptions on the Bourne stone are petroglyphs of Native American origins. He went on to say that pictured on the stone are wigwams in the lower left-hand corner, native houses, I guess, a white man and an Indian shaking hands, about a third along the bottom row, a crescent moon, a cross, a peace pipe, and it's an early example of colonial Indian handiwork. And his interpretation of what the whole thing meant was a white man journeyed 7 days on a trail to make a compact with the Indians beneath the light of a new moon. So that's where he got a white man journeyed 7 days to make a compact with the Indians under the light of a full moon based on this. I assume this is the wigwams, maybe. Maybe this is the people shaking hands. Somewhere there's a crescent moon, I guess, and other things in there. I guess it's sort of in the eye of the beholder in this case. So Delabar actually compared the figure. This is what he saw on the stone itself. These are the figures that he saw. He compared them with these figures that he believed he saw on Dighton Rock, another well-known stone here in Massachusetts with lots of pictographs, lots of drawings on it. He also compared it with a wampum belt from William Penn that shows two people having a compact, making a compact. And he also compared it with some petroglyphs, some carvings that were on an artifact that was found in Rhode Island at a Native American cemetery back in the 19th century, and there's these strange drawings on it, which I'm not sure why exactly he compared it with that, but just some other examples of petroglyphs there. One of the more popular interpretations that came up and started in the 1940s, it had a long history, was that the Vikings, that the stone represents runes that were carved on there by the Vikings. Professor Olaf Strandwald, graduate of Johannesburg Agricultural College in Norway and the University of North Dakota, listed the rune stone at Tuxet Mission, Bourne, Mass. As a sacred stone. He listed the stone as a rune stone inscribed with Norse runes. And he said there can be no reasonable doubt about its authenticity, and your stone has great historical value. He said in letters to the Historical Society here. He translated the inscription that was on the bottom as Jesus amply provides for us here and in heaven. And that he felt that was a fitting translation, that the Vikings would often use, I guess. And they felt it was fitting that this was at a meeting house, a native meeting house, if it actually did say Jesus amply provides for us here and in heaven. There's a long history of Vikings. People believing the Vikings were on Cape Cod. This is one of the most famous Viking sites, the sites that people think was a Viking site on Cape Cod, down in Yarmouth at Fullen's Pond. Down here, the excavator believed that he'd found evidence of various stones that had holes in them that he believed were mooring stones, Viking mooring stones. He found evidence of slipways that he believed that the Vikings had used to pull their boats up to work on them, basically. He believed he had found evidence of nails, like clinker nails, the kind of nails they'd use on the sides of the hold the Viking boats together. I believe he found evidence of those down there. Unfortunately, as far as we know, there's no concrete, substantial proof of Vikings anywhere south of Lansall Meadows up in Newfoundland. There's never been any really confirmed Viking artifacts that have been found down this way. People see the runes, those things that they think are runes, a lot of straight lines and such, and try to compare those with ones back in Norway and such, but there's no concrete evidence. We haven't found any Viking artifacts associated with radiocarbon dates. We can get a solid date on. There's one coin that was found up in Maine in a shell midden. It's a Viking coin. It's the right era. That was found at this shell midden up there. It's on display at the Maine State Museum now. But there's even controversy about that stone. A long time people have said, oh, well, that's great evidence that at least Vikings were trading down, to Maine back, 1,000 years ago. But there's even controversy around that about the circumstances of its finding and who found it and did they really find it or did this come into the collection later on, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, even that is suspect. We don't really know for sure. So the only solid Viking evidence we have is at Lansall Meadows. It doesn't mean that they weren't down here. It doesn't mean that the possibility doesn't exist that they were down here. It just means that we need to find evidence that they actually were, solid evidence that everybody can agree upon. Nobody believed that Lansall Meadows was actually a Viking site when that was first found. People, poo-pooed the whole thing and said, oh, no, that's ridiculous. There's no evidence for that. So there's no reason they couldn't have been down here. The sagas or, they aren't comprehensive enough and they're sort of obscure enough that you can interpret them different ways. So I'm always open to Vikings being down here. It's fine with me. I'm open to anybody being around here as long as we have that evidence, that good solid evidence. As archaeologists, what we're always looking for is that good solid evidence of something. So until we have that good solid evidence, we can't really consider the Vikings, even though it's a really popular interpretation. Another popular one was this guy here, Barry Fell, a marine biologist, who suddenly decided he could read runes in all sorts of different languages and such, and wrote a book called America BC back in the 1970s. His interpretation was that these runes were made by Hanno, an explorer from back at that time, and the interpretation of the top lines here and the bottom lines here was that it said proclamation. These top line says proclamation, and the bottom line says of annexation, do not deface, by Hanno take possession. So it almost sounds like one of those tags that you see on the mattresses, it says, do not remove under penalty of law, do not deface this stone. Hanno takes possession of this land or whatever. Very fanciful. Barry Fell was very popular back in the 70s. People loved the idea that there were Celts and there were Phoenicians and there are Carthaginians and all sorts of other European peoples that came over here. But again, the evidence falls short. Maybe this does look like I said, I'm no linguist, I'm no expert on runes, I'm no expert, neither was he, on all those writings, ancient writing and that sort of thing. But if they were here, we'd find evidence. There'd be artifacts. There'd be some kind of artifacts. There'd be some copper artifacts. There'd be some pottery. There'd be something. They didn't just come here and then pick up all their trash and go with them when they left. There'd be some trace of it left behind. All the archaeology we've done, there'd be some trace. So again, I'm open to it, but we just need that evidence again. So there's Hanno the Navigator. It's documented. There's tablets that have been found over in Greece that document the fact that, yes, he did. He was an explorer. He explored around the coast of Africa here. It's well documented on that tablet where he went beyond the Pillars of Hercules and into the area that we call Libya now and that sort of thing. So we have pretty good documentation there. But Barry Fell's interpretation was that, yes, Hanno did this exploration, and then he also did another one where he went across the ocean and he came to the New World, but unfortunately all that evidence, the tablet that describes that, has been lost over the years, so unfortunately we can't really prove it. So all we had to go on was Barry Fell's interpretation of it. Another one that came up that really it doesn't get a lot of airplay was the Phoenician interpretation. In 1990, Mark McMenamin translates the inscription as a stone marker with a Phoenician inscription and a map of Nantucket Sound. And the inscription he said that he believed he saw was stone marker that reveals 3+1 observations by Q. Whatever. I don't think he goes into any interpretation as to what that means or anything, but that was the Phoenician connection. Again, no evidence to support the Phoenicians over here. It's a long way for a Phoenician ship to come and such, so probably not the Phoenicians. A Middle Age translation, which I'm really surprised that some of those TV shows out there haven't grabbed onto and said that it's probably the Knights Templar or something like that. The Middle Age, Kirby's Middle Age translation. In 1991, Ian Kirby, professor of medieval English, visit Bourne to study the inscription. In 1993, he declares the inscription as authentic medieval runestone, but he couldn't really figure out what it said. He came up with all these letters that looked like letters that could match up with runes from medieval times. It sort of says Hakui at the end here and Homers, but he said there was no real consistency in the way the letters were placed, and that the larger marks on top were not runes anyway. So it's kind of a dead end. Like I said, maybe someone can fit the Knights Templar in there and say that it's leading to some treasure, hidden treasure or something like that. But as I said, that's surprised that it hasn't come up yet. But and then the more recent interpretations of the marks that are on the Bourne stone are that they could be Native American symbols. Way back in 1998, Carlson said this. Linnick in 2002, Zimmerman 2004, Paper in 2007, Williams 2014. They all came up to the conclusion that the marks are not runes, but look more like Native American symbols. Which, if you ever seen the Dighton Rock. Have you ever seen Dighton Rock, or have you ever seen some of these other native stones that are documented as native stones? You can see they do look similar. I mean, a lot of times they use straight lines, and they used carvings of different shapes and that sort of thing. So a lot of people look at that and kind of agree with that. The carvings themselves, when you get a chance, you get out there and really look at the carvings. Get down and look at them from the side, look at them from the other side, shine a light across them, look at them 100 different ways. What you see when you look at the stone is that the carvings are only on one face of the stone. It's hard to see the other face because it's under the stone and you can't really flip it over too easily. When I came here, I climbed down on the ground and I looked up at the underside of the stone. I looked along the edges of the stone. I tried to see if there are any other carvings, any place around the edges or on the bottom side of the stone or anything, and I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything that looked like any evidence of anything being pecked or carved or anything on there. The carving themselves are pretty shallow. If you run your fingers over them, they aren't really, really deep carvings. They're fairly shallow, but they're definitely there. Some people have said that the whole thing is probably it's just natural, just some natural cracks on the rocks or something like that, and people shouldn't make a big deal. Usually it's like Yale professors and Harvard professors and things like that say that, the ones who've never come down and seen the stone, but they just write it off. And that's, I'll talk about, that's one of the things that the stone has suffered from, is a lot of bad press. But there's shallow marks that are on there, but they're definitely present. Most of them look like they've been pecked onto the stone as opposed to carved out with a chisel. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. There's distinctive marks when you carve something with a metal chisel or a metal punch as opposed to when you peck it with a stone. It looks completely different. The three lowest ones on the left do look like they could possibly be chiseled. It's kind of hard to see exactly, but they are the deeper ones. There are a row of 4 traditionally identified at the top of the stone, and there's like 15 of them, around 15 or so, on the bottom of the stone. These ones on the bottom are more linear. The ones on the top are a bit more open to interpretation. But the ones on the bottom definitely look linear, sort of crossing over each other and such. The face of the stone itself, where the marks are, is very smooth. If you feel it, run your hands over it. It's definitely smooth. Which might go along with the fact that it appears to have served as a doorstone. From people walking over it all these years, it would have smoothed it out. It also could have just been the very smooth face of the stone when it was originally carved, just naturally smooth. The opposite side, and if you go over and look at the stone, put your hand on the underside and feel it. The opposite side is very rough, completely unworked. I looked all around the edges of the stone. I didn't see any evidence of chisel marks, or any evidence that the stone had been modified at all, that once it was larger and had been chiseled down smaller. I didn't see any evidence of that. There's one sort of chip mark that's on the edge of it, but it looks like more recent, like someone hit it with something by accident, or it goes bumped into something, or something like that. But again, that looks more recent. It's very fresh looking as opposed to the other marks that are on there. This is one of the things that really got me thinking. This rubbing that is here at the Historical Society, this is right over there next to the stone. I'd never seen it before. What someone appears to have done is laid a paper over the stone and then used like a charcoal pencil and rubbed it. It's a great idea. It's a really great way to get a really good actual representation of what's on the stone, basically, as opposed to just looking at it and then kind of coming up with your own ideas. I mean, this is the traditional interpretation of what's on the stone down at the bottom here, and it looks a lot different than this rubbing that was done up here, especially these marks that are on the top here. And after the talk, if you go over there and look at the stone, you can see this. Once I saw this and I looked at the stone, I was like, wow, this is completely different than what we're used to seeing. Unfortunately, I don't know. I don't think the society knows who did this rubbing. This rubbing, as I say, is possibly a real key to understanding the stone itself. It was done by someone, but I'm not sure who. If anyone knows who it was, please let me know. If they're still around, I'd like to thank them, but someone did it. I was telling the society that one of the things they might want to do in the future is take liquid latex, and paint liquid latex on the stone and then peel it off, and you'll have a positive cast of what's on the stone. And then you'll get a really great idea of what's there. Because it is hard to see these things because they are so shallow. But if you had that positive cast, using the latex. Or you could use plaster too. That would give you a big heavy thing that might weigh as much as the stone itself. But the latex would be a lot lighter. You could have it on display there as well. But it'll give you a good idea of what's there. Next slide, please. And if you flip it over, if you flip that thing over, like I said, traditionally everybody thinks of this being the top of the stone and that being the bottom of the stone. If you flip it over with that rubber, you get a whole different interpretation, a whole different view. Which literally is what I did when I was over there looking at the stone. I walked around the back side of the stone and I looked down at it. I was like, wow, this looks completely different than what you usually think. There's no reason to think it couldn't have been this way originally versus the other way. It's just literally a different way of looking at the stone. So what I did too, as a way of looking at it to try to authenticate it or try to see how it was made, is I took some clay, a simple method. I just took some clay, some of my son's Play-Doh basically, and I pressed it into some of the markings there to try to get a negative view of what it looked like and get a better idea about what the markings look like in there to get an idea of how they're made. And then one of the things I also did is I had a piece of Falmouth granite at home. This is a piece that I got on an archaeological dig down in Sandwich at the Nye homestead. I happened to be digging there, and this was just a chunk of stone. And the Nyes have a grinding wheel as their front doorstep there. And they said it was made out of Falmouth granite, and it looked just like this here. So I thought it was, oh, that's neat. I'll get a piece of Falmouth granite, just like that grinding stone they had. So I happened to have this at home, and what I did is I took a metal chisel, and I took a metal punch, and I took a series of stones. And I used a series of stones that did the pecking. That's what's on if I'm holding it like this, the left-hand side is just peck marks. The next one is the metal chisel. And then the next one is the metal punch. And I'll pass that around. You guys can take a look at it, feel it. And then you can go feel the stone itself later after the talk, and you can feel that it's very similar to it. So I was able to get a better idea about how it was being made. And that's something, again, that no one in the past has ever done. It ever started right from the very basics. We're looking at the provenience, we're looking at the manufacturing technique, and then we can look at the interpretation once we have some hard facts that we can start with and go on from. So what I found when I looked at the markings that were on there is that, as I said before, the majority of them appear that they've been pecked versus using a metal chisel and chiseled out. There are a few of them down here at the end, at that one end, some of these letters that are here that appear they may have been chiseled. They may have been a metal chisel that was used there. It might just be some really deep pecking. As I said, I spent about 2 hours looking at it, so it's not a super comprehensive examination of it. But some of them appear they may have been pecked, may have been chiseled, but the majority appear that they've been pecked. If you look at them there, it's pretty wide. There's a fairly narrow area that's actually been pecked. But then around it, there's also sort of a pecking halo, like you can see on that stone that I'm passing around as well, which is just the fact of when you're pecking it, sometimes you don't hit exactly where you want, and there's a bit of a halo that goes around it. So the person who pecked that stone spent a lot of time, or the persons, whoever it was, spent a lot of time pecking that. It's a hard rock. Granite is a hard rock. Falmouth granite is a hard rock. And it takes a bit to do some pecking to actually make a line. I mean, I spent maybe about 15 minutes doing that pecking that's on there, using quartz and using rhyolite. I think I even used a piece of flint, just some stones I had that had been shaped into points, basically, to peck in there, to little pecks, basically, like little chisels, stone chisels, to do the pecking on there. This is an example of some of the text that's on there. So see there's a backwards N, another backwards N, maybe a V, an A, a line, an H. You could come up with whatever kind of interpretations you want. Sometimes what happens is the whole thing sort of becomes sort of a Rorschach test. It's what you see. Yeah, I mean, you see what you want to see. And sometimes the interpretations that have happened in the past with the Bourne stone have been flavored by what's going on in society at the time. And I mean, to a degree, that's what the interpretations are that I'm making now. The Native American possible interpretation of it. It's based on more of an appreciation of Native American culture and that sort of thing. But way back in the 1940s, things like the Kennington runestone out in Minnesota was gaining popularity. The whole idea of Vikings coming over here, and you had a lot of settlers coming over from Norway, a lot of folks coming over from Norway and such were immigrating here. the Vikings became a very popular interpretation for lots of different things. There were a Viking site up in Charleston, they were saying was up the whole big giant Viking settlement that they found back in the 40s and such. But and then later in the 1970s, I'm not sure exactly why, but Barry Fell came up with that idea that everybody and their grandmother came over here from Europe way back thousands of years ago. But it had something to do with society and what was going on in society at the time. So like I said, it's a Rorschach test. It's an example of pareidolia, like when you look at the clouds and see dragons and whatever else in the clouds there. But to a certain degree, you got to look at it and say, okay, there are certain things we can definitely see there. Anyone can see there. All those different sort of letter shapes or geometric kind of shapes that are there. One of the really interesting things that I thought is what looks like a hand or a paw that's on the stone there. You can see that's the drawing there, and when you've been told that it's there, you can actually go and see it. I mean, these are pecked out. The whole paw that's here and the fingers. That's that D-shaped mark that you can see on the old interpretation that was there. That was the second mark in from the left-hand side if you're looking at it in the traditional way. But more interestingly, it looks like a hand or a paw. I mean, it really looks like a thumb sticking out and 4 other fingers. So whether it's a hand, a human hand, whether it's a bear paw, I don't know. Someone else could look at it and figure it out maybe. But another thing that's on the stone there is what looks like a boat. You see, it looks like the hull of a ship here, the mast of the ship, the sail of the ship here. Maybe somebody could say that's Phoenician. Maybe somebody else would say it's Carthaginian or something else. I don't know. That's what it looks like to me. It looks like a boat. Again, maybe it's pareidolia. Maybe it's my own biases. And then it looks like there's a set of boot prints, right on the side there. Again, when you look at the stone, and once someone points this out, you're like, hey, look at that. There it does look like a pair of boots. They almost look like there's a left and a right, just like the way they would be. And there's a heel in the back, and they're like life size that are there. But again, maybe it's not. Maybe that's not what they were intended to be. Maybe they were intended to be something completely different. But to me, they look like boots. There is many, many examples of petroglyphs of hands and feet all over Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all over the eastern woodlands. They're very common. What they mean, no one knows. Some people think they would put their hands on there as a way of showing that certain people lived in an area, that they would put feet on stones to represent journeys, that this is a trail or something like that. No one really knows. No one knows what the petroglyphs actually mean, but hands and feet are common things that Native Americans would carve onto stones, onto big stones, onto smaller stones. They peck them onto the stones there. So these are some examples of it. As far as I know, I haven't seen any ones that look like the ones that are on the Bourne stone, that sort of bear paw kind of thing, and the boots sort of thing. So those seem fairly unique, if that's what they actually are. But and the boat itself, I mean, I worked at Plymouth Plantation for a number of years. I worked on the Mayflower, I worked in the village, I worked at a native home site. I was all over the place there. And what really struck me is that the boat, the thing that I say is a boat that's on it, looks like a boat. It really looks like one of the Plymouth Plantation boats. There's something they would use back in the 17th century, a shallop that they'd used in the 17th century. There's that nice curved hull, just like you see here, sticking up in the back, just like that. There's the sail, there's the mast coming up, there's the sail coming out, just like you see on here. I don't know what this thing is on the front here. It doesn't fit into my interpretation, but maybe it's something else. I don't know. But anyway, that was my interpretation when I looked at it. I said, hey, it looks like a shallop. It looks like a ship's boat from the 17th century. And then some of the other markings that are on there, the lines and the things that look like M's and H's and that sort of thing. There's a lot of precedent for that in Native American writing that's known, from the 17th century. That's known from lithic artifacts that were known to have been created by Native Americans back in the period. This top piece here is up in Middleborough at Assawampset Pond, and some people believe it says Alexander. It was the signature of Alexander, who is one of Massasoit's sons, the sachem of the Wampanoag right before Philip, before Metacomet. They believe that's what this says here. But you can see it's got X's, it's got V's, it's got lines, it's got an A. This is a second piece here is a native gravestone. I think it's at the Old Colony Society up in Taunton now. That came from, I think it came from Plymouth originally. But you can see it's got faces on there, kind of like, I think Dighton Rock has some faces on it as well. It's got X's, it has V's, it has something that looks like an arrow. It's got this thing here, a little mark there. What it means, well, I have no idea. I don't think anyone knows nowadays, but it's a documented, artifact from the 17th century that has Native American markings that look very similar to things we see on the Bourne stone. Down at the bottom here are some Native American markings from some documents, 17th century documents. The Native Americans would sign their names with X's, and you always think, oh, someone can't read, so they just sign it with an X. They can't read or write, they just sign it with an X. That's not necessarily true for Native Americans anyway. It seems like the X is common, but you see it shows up. It shows up here, it shows up on that gravestone, so maybe the X had some other significance. It wasn't just an X mark. It had some kind of significance for the people back then. But you see other marks are M's and Y's and a weird circle thing with a line coming out of it, and all sorts of different symbols that would have had some sort of meaning to them. The marks on the stone, you can't see this one too well. It just gives you a general idea of some of those marks that are on there. Oh, and then this is a document from the 17th century that actually is from down in this area, talking about a land deal between some Native Americans. Richard Bourne was helping out with this land deal. And you can see one of the native signatures here, this one right here by Noawias. I'm sorry if I slaughtered his name, but his mark was that circle with the little line sticking out of it, which is similar to what some of the interpretations are on the Bourne stone, the circle with a little line that's coming out. So, maybe some of the marks that are on there are signatures of people, or, are some other kind of marking that, had, as I said, had some significance that we just don't really know what it is nowadays. Next slide. So, context. As I said, context is the key. I've been working on an excavation down in Yarmouth at Taylor Bray Farm. And we've been excavating down there, and it's a volunteer dig, and we're always stressing to the volunteers who are down there that it's important to find things in context. It's really cool to find a 9,000-year-old spear point. That's really great. If you find it, laying on a road somewhere, or you find it in someone's collection that they dug up years ago, but they don't know where it came from, it's still a neat thing, but knowing exactly where it came from on a site, how deep down in the ground it is, what is found along with, was it found with a hearth, was it found with burned animal bones, was it found just laying by itself? The context is the key for archaeologists for understanding things from the past. And this goes the same for the Bourne stone. For understanding the Bourne stone, the context of the Bourne stone is key. If you don't have the context, you can make up any kind of story you want about it. I've heard some stories that people were trying to say that Bourne stone was carried over by Vikings, who actually came from Norway and brought over here. It was a Viking burial marker that was brought over here. And if you don't have some kind of context of where it came from and facts about it, then you can come up with anything you want. But once you have that context, a hard or a soft context, then you're good to go on some stronger interpretations, basically. So as I say here, unfortunately, the hard context for the Bourne stone, for where it came from, may be missing, but we have a soft context. And what that means is that we don't have someone actually with a photograph showing the Bourne stone at the meeting house, or showing the Bourne stone at some other location within Bourne before it came to the trading post. We don't have a 17th century record that says on July 15th, 1685, so-and-so, Massasoit carved this stone down in Bourne, and here are the markings. Those would be hard context. But we have a soft context, but our soft context is still good. It's somewhat of an oral tradition, but it's an oral tradition that goes back to the very moment that it seems that the Bourne stone actually came to prominence, became known to people, or more well known to people when it came to the trading post. What we try to do as archaeologists is we try to use what's called Occam's razor, Occam's razor. It's an ancient thing, goes back to the 15th century. I think it was this 15th century monk that came up with this idea. And basically what he said is that among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. Usually, if you have to make more and more excuses for something to be true, then it's less likely to be true. So the thing with the most facts and with the fewest assumptions that you need to make about it is probably the more likely thing to be true. That doesn't always hold. There's some wild things out there that have been found, some wild stuff. But again, it's all things that have been documented and tested, that we have facts to go along with it. So if you're using Occam's razor and you say, okay, well, could the Bourne stone be a Viking stone? It would be carved by the Vikings. Okay, well, then you have to say, well, the Vikings must have come over here. And you say, well, it's not documented they came over here. Well, maybe they came. Maybe you could use the Vinland sagas and say that they came down this way. And well, the markings don't quite look like Viking runes. Well, maybe that's because the ones who came over here weren't quite as literate as some of the other ones that came over here. And then you keep adding more things to it, and you have to keep making more and more excuses to it. And the story just gets more and more fanciful. It's not as hard and as fast as if you have a lot of just facts that go along with it. So if you get a hypothesis that has more facts, it's a very simple hypothesis. It's usually the one that's more likely to be true. The tradition is that that the stone came from the Indian meeting house at Great Herring Pond, which was also called Pumpaspisit and Kumaskumananit. If we accept this tradition, which is the soft context, what does this mean? Okay, so we say, okay, so the tradition is that it came from this meeting house. Well, how can we help substantiate that it actually could have come from this meeting house? What else can we figure out? Okay, the Great Herring Pond Meeting House, the meeting house we're talking about, was built in 1688. This is a great meeting house because we actually have some documentation about how big it was when it was built, all those sorts of things. Built in 1688 by a carpenter named Edward Milton. It was funded by Judge Samuel Sewell. He was the one that became the big witchcraft trial judge up in Salem eventually. He records that the meeting house measured 24 feet long, 18 feet wide, and had 2 galleries. So it was smaller than this room, and it would have had balconies up on either of the sides for more people, to fit more people in there. Thomas Tupper Jr. was the preacher there, and the congregation in 1693 numbers 226. And Pilgrim Hall actually has the original documentation that lists all the native people who were here in 1693, what their names were, and the total count of the number of people that were there. The tradition, the oral history, is that the building eventually became infested with black snakes, and it was abandoned and eventually moved to the other side, to the east side of the pond. That again is another soft context. I'm not sure where that came from. It shows up in Lovell's book, the history down here, but I'm not sure where he gets that from. So those are the facts we know about the meeting house. Location of the meeting house, I think from what I can tell, is right down there at the Indian Cemetery. That's still there nowadays. It would not be crazy to think that the meeting house was right there where the cemetery is, and that people were initially buried around the meeting house, and then once the meeting house was gone, they were buried within the area where the meeting house was. We found this to be the case, or a similar case, up in Duxbury. When we did some archaeological investigations up there, we did ground-penetrating radar at the Miles Standish burial ground up there. We were looking for the first meeting house of Duxbury up there. And what we found is that we actually found stains in the ground that matched right where it should be. It's on a nice high little knoll at the meeting house cemetery. We found these stains in the ground, and we found that there were graves all around where the stains were. And so it looks like they were burying all around the meeting house. And then in that case, they never buried anyone within that meeting house space. Once the meeting house was gone, they just continued to bury around the meeting house and not within the meeting house space. So it may be a similar situation at the cemetery down there, the Great Herring Pond Cemetery. So we know where the cemetery is. We know where we have a good idea where the meeting house was. What the meeting house looked like, it was probably a fairly simple affair. It was late 17th century. They weren't big fancy things. This is a sort of a Plymouth Plantation kind of house. Very simple, timber framed. It's got clapboards on the outside. It has one door, has a window. It's a bit smaller than the size of the meeting house. This is an African meeting house in the New World. It's not in Africa, but it's here, dating to the 18th century. It has one central door. It looks like it's about the right size. Central door, a couple of windows that may be shining light up towards the gallery, and it very well could have, the original meeting house very well could have looked like one of these or both of these kind of combined together, something like that. And the Bourne Historical Society, once I came down, I looked at the stone, and I said, we need to establish some context from it. Mary here at the Historical Society, she started digging through the records, the historical records, which nobody had ever done before, because we had some names that were associated with the Bourne stone. We had that Catherine Parker, we had that Andrew Jackson, and we had Miss Fisher. So we had some good names, and this is not ancient history. This is 1930s or maybe late 19th century, early 20th century. So if these people were real, if they weren't just figments of someone's imagination that they attached to this history of the Bourne stone, we should be able to find them somewhere. The tradition is that Catherine Parker and Andrew Jackson were both Native Americans. They were both probably of the Great Herring Pond tribe. And so we figure, well, maybe they were living in that same area. What Mary did, was actually go out and do that research, like looking through books and looking through documents and that sort of thing. And she found that, this is the Parker property right there, the Catherine Parker property right there. Here's the burial ground, the meeting house. There's the Parker property, virtually right across the street. And she also found that Parker had a person named Jackson living in the house on one of the records that she found. So here we are, Parker with the Andrew Jackson living in the same house, with a Jackson living in the same house. And subsequently, once the property had been sold in the 1930s, it went to a family named Fisher. So here we go. It all connects together. This one piece of property ties in those three. There's another document that says that the house that was there, the Parker Jackson house, burned in 1932. So that fits right in. New property owners got the house. The stone was there, being used as a doorstep. The tradition is that it was moved from here over to that Andrew Jackson Parker property, which, right across the street. That wouldn't be that crazy to move it. And so, we have some good, more hard context that's giving us more evidence. Now, if we would have started looking at the documentation and either A, not been able to find these names anywhere in the town records, or B, found that they were living somewhere else completely, living way out the end of Cape Cod or living, way at the other side of Bourne, then it would have been, a little more suspect. We'd be kind of like, well, maybe we have to start making assumptions and putting in, some more qualifiers in there and that sort of thing. Well, maybe it could have gone over there somehow, but when you have the folks living right across the street from where the meeting house was, that's pretty good evidence that, most likely it did come from the meeting house and was moved right across the street. And when we start looking at the history of the area down here, Great Herring Pond, what's called Great Herring Pond now, the Great Herring Pond tribe, was originally the native community of Manomet. Manomet was a well-known native community in the 17th century, well-known by the Pilgrims, probably well-known by other Europeans that came over here. We know when the Pilgrims came over in the 1620s, they said that the English and the French and the Dutch were all trading at Manomet with the natives who were there. One of the reasons they built the Atuxet trading post at Manomet, because it was a well-known trading location already. So these folks down here, the native folks down here, already had a tradition of interaction with Europeans. The early Pilgrims interaction was right back in 1621. John Billington Jr., the little kid, he decides he wants to go exploring, and he wanders out of the village, starts wandering down native trails, probably following 3A, what's now 3A. Wanders all the way down from Plymouth, ends up at Manomet. And what do the natives at Manomet do? They ship them off to other side of Cape Cod. They ship them off to Nauset. Ship them all the way down there, out to a sachem down there named Aspinet. They sent them down there because the folks at Nauset, of course, had trouble with the Pilgrims when they first landed. That whole first encounter thing that went on. So maybe the folks at Nauset wanted to talk to the Pilgrims. They figured, if we take this kid over here, we hold on to this kid, maybe the Pilgrims come looking for him, and then we can have a discussion with them. Then later, in October of 1622, William Bradford came down here and traded corn along Cape Cod. This was when Squanto actually died out on the outer part of Cape Cod, in Manamoick. Out there, Squanto died, and Bradford goes and leaves the corn at Manomet with the sachem Cunicum, who's at Manomet. Cunicum says, yep, I'll take care of it. I'll hold on to it for you until you come back for it. So they left it there in October. In March 1623, Miles Standish comes down to retrieve that corn from Cunicum at Manomet. And while he's there, this runner comes in from Wessagusset, from way up in the Weymouth area. This runner comes in, and he finds out that, Standish finds out that this runner is coming down trying to get Connachum to join in a confederacy against the Pilgrims, to attack the Pilgrims and wipe them out, wipe out all the ones who are giving them trouble up at Weymouth and Wessagusset, and then wipe out the Pilgrims at the same time, so to do a preemptive strike and get rid of them all before the Pilgrims could cause more troubles, they felt. After this, what happened is Standish got a number of men together, including a native man that was living outside the plantation named Hobbamock, who was a Panis, who was a warrior, and they went up there and they did a preemptive strike against the natives at Wessagusset, and they killed a number of the natives. They brought one of their, a man named Wittawama, they brought his head back on a pike, brought a bloody cloth, a cloth that was soaked in his blood, and had it as a flag hanging on the Pilgrim village. So they brought all that back, and they were able to show the natives that they were here to stay, they weren't going to be bullied around, they weren't going to be pushed around. And as a result, what happened is that a lot of natives, including the ones who were down there at Manomet and the ones who were out on, a lot of the ones on Cape Cod, they were afraid all of a sudden of the Pilgrims. They thought that the Pilgrims were going to come down and do the same thing to them that they had done up there at Wessagusset. So the records say that a lot of the native people fled into the swamps to hide from the Pilgrims, and many of them ended up dying. The sachem, supposedly the sachem of Manomet there, Connachum and Aspinet out there on Nauset and Iano in Hyannis, what's now Hyannis, they all fled into the swamps with their people, and those people died. So in conclusion, so what have we learned from all this, after all this tangled web? It's much more probable for the Bourne stone to be a product of Native American manufacture versus Viking, Phoenician, or Carthaginian, or anything else you can think of there. Why? Why is it more probable with that? Well, if we use Occam's razor, we now have a context for where the stone came from. We have a soft context, but it's a bit harder because society was actually able to trace the names that were associated with it, and we found out they were right near there. We also looked at the carvings that are on there and what the carvings show. A lot of the carvings are very similar to other Native American carvings from this area. The lines, the X's, those sort of markings, the hand shape, while not exactly matching other Native American markings from around here, it's similar. They made hand shapes and foot shapes, the boots and that sort of thing. If it did come from the meeting house, this is where we get into a bit more speculation, a bit more hypotheses, a bit more storytelling. Maybe it was already in the community. It's pecked. It shows up at the meeting house in the 1680s, we think. We think it was moved there around that time, or at least sometime after the 1680s when the meeting house was built. But it's been pecked. By the 1680s, Native Americans around here, as far as we know, had virtually abandoned the use of stone tools. By the 1680s, they would have been well familiar with and had plenty of access to things like metal chisels, metal punches, metal nails even, to be able to chisel things onto stones like that. So the technology to create the markings that are on the Bourne stone seems to show that it's more something that was created before extended European contact. So, in the earlier part of the 17th century, maybe even earlier than that. And the movement from one location to another location, since it doesn't seem like it was created at the Herring Pond, and it is, fairly portable. Enough guys can get together, they can lift it or drag it somewhere. It may have been in the main part of the community, the main village location, and subsequently may have been moved up to the meeting house when the meeting house was built, either by the natives or by Thomas Tupper or someone, and it may have symbolically shown a change from the savage heathen ways to the Christian ways by taking and civilizing this stone. Stones are very important to Native people. Lots of different sort of sacred stones are around, and so either in Thomas Tupper's mind, or in some of the natives who are real converts, their mind, by taking the stone that would have been a sacred stone within the community, by taking it and bringing it to the English meeting house, the meeting house for the natives that was English style, it could have been a way of showing that they were now civilized. They were no longer, the way their ancestors were. They were going to be good Christian Indians or something. Again, if we look down here, it was probably created during the 17th century contact period, and a little more speculation even, because it has, in my mind, what look like boots and what looks like a boat on there and a hand. It may even record early interaction, the Manamet people's early interaction with either the Pilgrims or other earlier 17th century ships and Europeans. In the 17th century, the native people called the Europeans either coatmen because of their coats, because the coats were something different to the native people, and so that was distinctive Europeans being coatmen, or they called them knife men, men who carried knives, who provided knives. So something like boots being worn by native people, by Europeans, would also be something that would be seen as different in the natives' minds. And they wear shoes, they had moccasins and such, but they didn't have these hard-soled boot things. And so maybe they would have represented those. Maybe the stone was near the water. Maybe that's near the place where these first Europeans came and set foot on the native soil or something like that. And the ship that's on there, that possible ship that I saw, maybe that's a shallop. Maybe that's the first European boat that they saw, or maybe it records something with the Pilgrims, or maybe it's something completely else altogether. But it's a neat, new, different kind of theory that we can play around with now too. So we do know that in the 17th century, it was recorded that the first ship that the natives saw, the first European ship that the natives saw, they said they looked out in the water and they saw what they thought was a floating island out there, a moving island out there. And as it got closer, it looked like it had big, tall trees on this island, but the clouds were down low over the trees. And then as they got closer, they could look on the trees, and they thought they saw bears climbing up and down the trees. And so, of course, the floating island is a ship. The trees are the masts, the clouds are the sails, and the bears are the sailors, running up and down the mast in the rigging, doing things in the rigging there. So so it shows how native people would try to conceptualize these new European things within their own minds. And so it may have been a similar situation here. For some reason, they may have taken things that were European, the boots and the ship, and try to conceptualize and put that into their own native culture, and maybe try to tell the story of when they had some kind of interaction with Europeans by way of doing this traditional carving on the rock. But in any way, whatever reason the stone was created, it was probably a sacred stone within the native community back then, wherever it was originally, and then moved to the meeting house site. In the big scheme of things, it was probably a sacred stone in some sense, but unfortunately, after all these years, what we're left with is just speculation and hypotheses and new stories. But Native American community, back in the 17th century and before, and even nowadays, a lot of it is based on story and all the history and that sort of thing. So making up stories about the Bourne stone is just part of a long tradition. So many thanks to the Bourne Historical Society for reaching out to me unexpectedly to come down and do this talk. That's all I have. Thank you, everybody. Thanks everyone for coming.